The universal star selector selects and applies styles to literally all of our elements, giving everything a margin of 0, a padding of 0, a line height of 1.5, and just for fun a color of red. We see our styles were applied on every single element. The type selector selects elements by their name. I have some h1s, h2s, and h3s. In my CSS, I'll select my h1 elements by their name, I'll give them a color of red, and when I save, we see only our h1 elements are now red. The class selector selects elements by their class attribute. I'm building a header, and using classes, I can assign declarative names to my elements. To select them, we start with a dot followed by the name of the class. After applying my styles, we see our header is fully styled. The ID selector is used to select a specific element with a unique ID attribute. IDs should be unique to a single element. I'll give my first anchor element an ID called current, and to select it, we start with a hashtag followed by the name of the ID. We see our anchor element is now styled. By comma separating selectors, we can group them together and have them all share the same styles. The adjacent sibling combinator is placed between two selectors and checks whether the second selector is defined immediately after the first selector as a sibling. In this case, we're checking if the h2 is defined immediately after the h1, and since it is, we see our h2 is red. The general sibling combinator checks whether the second selector is defined anywhere as a sibling to the first selector. In this case, we're checking if the h3 is defined anywhere as a sibling to the h1, and since it is, we see our h3 is red. The direct child combinator checks whether the second selector is defined anywhere inside the first selector as a direct child. In this case, we're checking if the h4 is defined directly inside the wrapper, and since it is, we see our h4 is red. The descendant combinator checks whether the second selector is defined anywhere inside the first selector, regardless of how deeply nested it is. The space between both selectors is actually the descendant combinator selector, and in this case, we're checking if the h4 is defined anywhere inside our wrapper, regardless of how deeply nested it might be. As of August 2023, and as an alternative to the descendant combinator, we can select child elements simply by nesting our selector inside the parent element. When I save, we see our h4 is red. A compound selector is when multiple selectors are combined without spaces. For example, this compound selector targets all buttons that have the button class and the primary class. The styles will only apply if all of these conditions are met. We can also select elements by any attributes they may have. I have 3 inputs with a required attribute, and to select them, we use square brackets with the name of the attribute inside. We see our inputs are now red. We can also prepend any element we want, like only input elements, and we see only input elements that are required are now red. We can include the value of an attribute in our selector. For example, all buttons with the type attribute of submit. I have links that use both HTTP and HTTPS. With CSS, I can target all HTTPS links by using the caret symbol, which selects attribute values that start with a specific text. Instead of selecting from the start, we can select from anywhere with the star symbol. When I set the value to YouTube, we see only YouTube is red. Instead of selecting from the start or the middle, we can select from the end with the $sign. When I set the value to .io, we see only GitHub is red. We can use the tilde symbol to select a specific value from a list of values. For example, in an attribute with multiple values, like a class with many names, we can target and style elements containing a specific class name. We can select elements with an attribute value that either exactly matches the value or starts with the value followed by a hyphen. For example, a language attribute of exactly English, or this will also select any characters after English as long as the very next character is a hyphen. The root pseudo-class represents the HTML element and is commonly used to define global CSS variables. The first child pseudo-class selects the first element in a group of sibling elements. In an unordered list, we can select the first list element with the first child pseudo-class. The last child pseudo-class selects the last element in a group of sibling elements. In an unordered list, we can select the last list element with the last child pseudo-class. The nth-child pseudo-class selects one or more elements in a group of sibling elements. This pseudo-class is also a function, and inside the parentheses, we can select any list element we want. If I set it to 1, we see it selects the first list element. If I set it to 5, we see it selects the fifth list element. If I set it to odd, we see it selects all the odd numbers. If I set it to even, it selects all of the even numbers. We can also select all of our list items with n. We see all of our list items are now red. If I set it to 2n, we see it selects in steps of 2. If I wanted to select in steps of 2, but starting from the first element, we can do -1. We see, now it's selecting in steps of 2, starting from the first element. And if we wanted these conditions to only apply to certain list elements, we can say of.selected, and we see only list elements with a class of selected are being targeted. The nth-last-child pseudo-class is exactly like the nth-child pseudo-class, but it starts with the last child. So for example, when I use the nth-last-child pseudo-class and set it to 1, we see setting it to 1 selected the last list element. The nth-of-type pseudo-class is exactly like the nth-child pseudo-class, however each sibling needs to be the same element. The nth-last-of-type pseudo-class is exactly like the nth-of-type pseudo-class where each sibling needs to be the same element, but it starts at the last child. The first-of-type pseudo-class selects the first element of its type among a group of sibling elements. The last-of-type pseudo-class selects the last element of its type among a group of sibling elements. The only-of-type pseudo-class selects an element that has no sibling of the same type. For example, this div is the only div element among its siblings. The only-child pseudo-class selects an element that has no siblings. For example, I have 2 unordered lists. The first has multiple list elements, and the second only has 1. When I use the only-child pseudo-class on all list elements, only the list element without any sibling is red. The empty pseudo-class selects an element with no content inside of it, whether that be text, child elements, or even whitespace. My second box is empty, and so when I style it with the empty pseudo-class, we see our empty box is now green. The hover pseudo-class applies styles when the user hovers over an element. For example, when I hover over this button, we see it turns red. The active pseudo-class applies styles to an element while it's being clicked or activated. As long as I hold down the mouse button on this link, it remains red. The focus pseudo-class applies styles to an element when it gains focus, like when a user clicks or tabs on a form field. When I press tab on my keyboard to tab over to different input elements, we see they get our outline, and the same happens when I click on them. The focus visible pseudo-class is like the focus pseudo-class, but it only applies focus when navigating using the keyboard. For example, I have this button with a focus visible state. Clicking it does nothing, but when I tab over it, we get our outline. The focus within pseudo-class applies styles to an element if any of its children are currently focused on. For example, when I click on any one of my inputs, we see not only is the input highlighted with an outline, but so is the div that wraps it, and this is because I gave that div the focus within pseudo-class. The autofill pseudo-class applies styles to inputs that have been autofilled by the browser. The disabled pseudo-class selects form elements that are disabled. For example, I disabled my button by giving it the disabled attribute, and in my CSS, I'm styling the disabled state with a cursor of not allowed and a background color of gray. Alternatively, the enabled pseudo-class selects form elements that are not disabled. The placeholder-shown pseudo-class selects any input or text area element that is currently displaying placeholder text. The read-only pseudo-class selects form elements that are not editable. To make a form element read-only, you give it the read-only attribute. And now that these input elements are no longer editable, we can use the read-only pseudo-class to style only those elements that are read-only. Opposite to the read-only pseudo-class, we can use the read-write pseudo-class to style elements that are editable. The default pseudo-class selects the default element in a group of related elements inside a form. For example, I have 4 checkboxes and the second one is checked by default. I can use the default pseudo-class to style the input element that is checked by default. Similar to the default pseudo-class, the checked pseudo-class applies styles to any radio, checkbox, or option element that is checked or toggled on. The indeterminate pseudo-class represents form elements whose state is indeterminate. For example, when all radio elements are unchecked, this is considered to be an indeterminate state, and we can style the state with the indeterminate pseudo-class. The valid pseudo-class selects form elements whose contents validate successfully. For example, I have a number input and the minimum is 18. When the value is below 18, nothing happens, but when the number reaches 18, we see our input validates and we get our green outline. Opposite to the valid pseudo-class, the invalid pseudo-class selects form elements whose contents fail to validate. The user-valid pseudo-class is almost exactly the same as the valid pseudo-class, with the only difference being that unlike valid, user-valid only matches after the user has interacted with the element. For example, the minimum is 18, and when I increase the number to 18, we see still nothing happens. I have to click away for it to add our green outline. Opposite to the user-valid pseudo-class, user-invalid has the exact same behavior, but only when the input fails to validate. The in-range pseudo-class selects input elements whose current value is within the range limits specified by the min and max attributes. For example, I have an input with a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 6. As long as I'm inside this range, we get our green outline. Opposite to the in-range pseudo-class, the out-of-range pseudo-class selects input elements whose current value isn't within the range limits. The required pseudo-class selects any form element that has the required attribute set on it. Opposite to the required pseudo-class, the optional pseudo-class selects any form element that does not have the required attribute set on it. The link pseudo-class targets links that haven't been visited yet. We see the only link that is red is Discord, and this is because I haven't visited the Discord website recently. The visited pseudo-class targets links that have already been visited. We see both Google and Amazon are red because I've already visited those websites. The anyLink pseudo-class applies styles to both visited and unvisited links. We see all my links are red regardless of whether I visited them before or not. The target pseudo-class selects an element that matches with the ID in the URL. So for example, we see in my CSS, I have the target pseudo-class and I'm giving it a background, a padding, and a border radius. At first glance, this doesn't seem to do anything. However, when I click on any one of my links, like the About link, we see our About section gets the styles we applied on our target pseudo-class. And this is because if we look at the URL, we see at the end we have the ID of our About section. If the ID in the URL matches the ID given to an element, the styles defined in the target pseudo-class gets applied on that element. A new feature of CSS is the ability to scope your styles to specific sections of your HTML. So for example, when I give a color of red to H2 elements, we see it applies the color of red to literally all H2 elements. But what I can do is use the scope at rule, move up my H2 rule set, and inside the parentheses, I can specify where to scope our rule set. My About section has an ID called About. So inside the parentheses, I can just say hashtag About, and now whatever I add inside the curly braces will be scoped to the About section. We see only the H2 element in the About section is now red. Furthermore, I can use the scope pseudo-class to select the root of the scope. The root of the scope is the section element with the ID of About. And when I give it a background color, a padding, and a border radius, we see our properties were applied to the About section. And this is because the About section is the root of the scope. The defined pseudo-class represents any element that is defined. However, this is useful because it only includes custom elements. In JavaScript, we can create custom elements and we can use the defined pseudo-class to apply styles to all elements, including custom elements. The full-screen pseudo-class selects any element that is currently in full screen. I have a wrapper with some elements inside of it. With JavaScript, we can make elements go full screen, and I made it so when I click on this button, the wrapper goes full screen. We see our wrapper turns pink in full screen and turns back yellow when not in full screen, and this is controlled by the full screen pseudo-class. The modal pseudo-class selects modals. In my HTML, I created a modal using the dialog element, and I have this button that opens it using the show modal method in JavaScript. In my CSS, to select our modal, I can use the modal pseudo-class, and when I give it a border radius of 16 pixels, we see our modal now has a border radius. The picture-in-picture pseudo-class selects the video that is currently in picture-picture mode. When I click on this button, it toggles on the picture-in-picture mode, and we get our red border around our video. As an alternative to grouping selectors by comma separating them, we can use the is pseudo-class, and inside the parentheses, we can apply styles to an entire group of selectors. Keep in mind that the selector with the highest specificity will be the specificity for this entire rule set. The where pseudo-class is exactly like the is pseudo-class, with the only difference being that it has zero specificity regardless of which type of selector is being selected. The not pseudo-class can exclude an element from being selected. For example, I can style all paragraph elements except for the first one, and we see they all turn red except the first one. The hash pseudo-class selects an element if what's inside the parentheses is true. For example, if the wrapper has an h1 element inside of it, then select the wrapper and give it a red border. There's an HTML API called popover, which you might not be familiar with, which allows us to create popovers like the one you see when I click on this menu button. However, it's currently in the middle of the screen, so to move it, I can select it with the popover-open pseudo-class, and using position properties to move it, we see my popover is now below my menu button. The directional pseudo-class selects elements based on their direction. For example, I have two H1 elements, one in English and one in Arabic. Some languages, such as Arabic, are read from right to left, and we can select those elements with the directional pseudo-class. Inside the parentheses, we specify the direction, and we see our Arabic heading is now red. The language pseudo-class selects elements based on their language. For example, I have the same paragraph in 3 different languages, and I'm explicitly defining their language as attributes in my HTML. I can select the French paragraph explicitly because it's French with the lang pseudo-class, and inside the parentheses, say FR for French. We see the French paragraph is now red. The before pseudo-element inserts content before the selected element. For example, I can insert this icon at the beginning of my anchor element. The after pseudo-element inserts content after the selected element. For example, I can insert this icon at the end of my anchor element. The first letter pseudo-element selects the first letter in a body of text. The first line pseudo-element selects the first line in a body of text. The backdrop pseudo-element selects the box that is rendered beneath top layer elements. For example, this is my modal from earlier, and I can add a dark transparent background behind it using the backdrop pseudo-element. The Q pseudo-element selects web VTT captions in a video. For example, I have this video with subtitles. I can use the Q pseudo-element to increase the font size and change the color. The file-selector-button pseudo-element selects input elements of type file. In my HTML, we see I have an input with a type of file, and in my CSS, I can style it using the file-selector-button pseudo-element. The marker pseudo-element allows us to change the bullets in list elements to something else. The placeholder pseudo-element allows us to style the placeholder in an input. The selection pseudo-element allows us to style the selections we make when we highlight over text with our mouse. The host pseudo-class selects the host custom element in its shadow DOM when using web components. When I give the host a background color of light blue, we see it was applied on our custom element. When working with web components, you can't use classes to select your elements from outside the shadow DOM. As an alternative, we can give our elements the part attribute and then select them in CSS using the part pseudo-element. Again, when working with web components, the slotted pseudo-element selects elements that have been placed into a slot inside an HTML template. Instead of scrolling to a section using an ID fragment, you can do so with a text fragment. And the target text pseudo-element represents the text that has been scrolled to. So for example, I have this anchor element that links to a text fragment, and when I click on it, it scrolls us down to where that text is. And we see our text is highlighted in purple because we told it to in our target text pseudo-element. However, at the time of recording this video, this feature does not have good browser support. In fact, the following 17 selectors covered in the rest of this video are not well supported by browsers. But stick around because I have 2 bonus CSS tricks at the end you're probably not familiar with. The host context pseudo-class is used when you want to apply styles to the shadow host based on conditions outside the shadow DOM. The blank pseudo-class is like the empty pseudo-class, with the only difference being that blank allows for whitespace. The local link pseudo-class selects links that link to the same website. The target within pseudo-class is exactly like the target pseudo-class, however it checks within itself for any element that are being targeted by the URL. The playing, paused, buffering, muted, seeking, stalled, and volume logged pseudo-classes all select videos based on their current state. The current, past, and future pseudo-classes are time-dimensional pseudo-classes designed to match elements along a timeline, making it possible to style the subtitles in videos. The Q region pseudo-element is used for styling subtitles relative to the location of the user. The grammar error and spelling error pseudo-elements apply styles to a body of text that the browser has flagged as grammatically incorrect. Here's a trick to add space in between elements. All I have is a div with a class called wrapper, and inside it 4 paragraphs all with a class called description. Looking at my live server, we see there's no gaps in between any of them. The problem is if I select my paragraph and give them a margin top, for example, we see we did add space in between each paragraph, but we also added space above the first paragraph. This is not what we want. We only want space in between our paragraphs. To do this, I can select the parent div by its class name of wrapper. I'll append to it the direct child combinator, the star selector, the adjacent sibling combinator, and another star selector. I'll give it a margin top of 2 rem, and when I save, we see space was only added in between our paragraphs. To better see how this works, I'll replace margin top for a border of 5 pixels, solid green. When I save, we see each paragraph now has a green border, except for the first one, and this is essentially how this selection works. We're selecting the wrapper, saying we want everything inside it, and if we stop here, we see each paragraph now has a green border. But when I add back the adjacent sibling combinator and star selector, this is saying select everything after the first child, and we see every paragraph now has a green border except for the first one. And this is what we want, because now I'll add back our margin top of 2rem, and we see by selecting every paragraph except for the first one, giving them a margin top allows us to add space in between each one of them without also adding space above the first one. Another way we can do the exact same thing is instead of using combinator selectors, we can use the not pseudo class. I'll comment out our rule set, and this time, instead of selecting the wrapper, I'll select the paragraphs directly by their class name of description. I'll append to it the not pseudo class, and inside the parentheses, I'll use the first child pseudo class. I'll give it a margin top of 2rem, and when I save, we see this works the exact same. We're selecting each paragraph except for the first one and giving them a margin top, adding space only in between our paragraphs. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.